Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now to a story of terminal, misbegotten despair that never seems to end but only appears to get worse. As one analyst put it, to call Haiti a fragile state before last week's assassination of President Jovenel Moïse would be generous. A cycle of delayed elections, public frustration, and fraying political legitimacy, coupled with raging insecurity, rapidly increasing worries about food, and an ongoing and unchecked pandemic, amounts to a whole lot more than fragile. Well, the Caribbean island found a way to plunge further into chaos after a group of what appeared to be highly trained and heavily armed gunmen stormed the presidential residence in Port-au-Prince and shot President Moise to death. Like most of the world, Haitians were caught off guard by the brazen attack. But the police appeared to mobilize quickly, and some 24 people suspected of involvement in the assassination were arrested, 3 of them Haitian-born with U.S. ties. So now that the slow-motion train wreck that is Haiti has spiraled from perpetual political paralysis, turmoil and misery into a presidential assassination, what now and what next for the Caribbean island? Well, for her analysis, I'm joined now from Washington by the Associate Director for Advocacy at the Global Health Incubator, Angela Bruce-Raeburn, who was the former Senior Policy Advisor for Humanitarian Response in Haiti for Oxfam. Thank you very much indeed, Angela, for joining us. We appreciate the time that you've taken. So a very dynamic situation indeed still unfolding in Haiti since the assassination of President Moise. The initial shock still there, of course, and the new reality being taken in for what all that entails for the populace and for the new administration, if an administration can be called that in Haiti. But now comes the aftermath. What is your assessment of that?
Thank you for having me and for this discussion. I think I'd like to contextualize a little bit the way we're talking about Haiti, recognizing that it's not only all the things that you described, but there's also a very important aspect to all these issues in Haiti that is rooted in the international community and the way the international community has really engaged in this country for decades. So in your response to your first question, I really try to engage with colleagues in Haiti yesterday just to get a sense of what is actually happening versus what is being reported, and really trying to ensure that our narrative about what's happening on the ground is accurate, right? So one of the things that I know that I was told yesterday is, yes, it's a security nightmare because of the fact that so many gangs in certain parts of the country has been able really to take control. That's a fact. There's also the fact that Haitians have, across political aisles, they condemn the murder of the president, despite whether or not there were people who were opposed to his rule or to his mandate. They condemn it. But what really came out of my discussions with several Haitian colleagues yesterday was the fact that there is this need for Haitian people to be in charge of their own governance, their own ability to make their own decisions about what's best for the country. And with the amount of international scrutiny and international involvement and international engagement that has not always been for the best interests of this country, there's the added burden of trying to figure out how to manage a political crisis where more than one person is vying for the role of president, with the United Nations being in the country, as well as a new U.S. administration on outside, and of course the pandemic. So you can imagine that an already fragile environment is really being tested now with the assassination of the president and the political machinations that's going to happen now to fill the vacuum created by his murder.
Well, we appreciate your setting that out for us, and I think you did so very accurately and sensitively. But let's take things one after the other, because I want to get to the point where we're going to talk about the political crisis and hope that you will give us the benefit of your analysis, as well as you talked about gangs and so on that proliferate all over the place. But let's talk about the investigation first of all, which is going on about the perpetrators of the attack on the president. They found 26 Colombian nationals, along with 2 or 3, I think, Haitian Americans that were involved, 8 still on the run, 3 killed. What are you hearing about that from your contacts in Haiti? Because this is something that's still developing, and there's talk of more capture of the attackers, but this is not yet confirmed.
According to the 2 people that I spoke to in Haiti yesterday, this conversation is ongoing, but you realize Haiti is a country of intrigue as well. And so there's this notion that people are waiting and to see what exactly is going to come of this investigation, right? There was this sense that this attack happened and people weren't really fleeing in the way that you would expect attackers to flee. So there's a lot of missing information. There's a sense that people want to wait and see, but not to really give a lot of credibility, really, to what is being, bantered about in the media. There's also one of the people I spoke to yesterday said that there's a sense that there's no need for military intervention in the country, but that the Haitians want, if they're going to take any international help, they want international help to investigate, to bring these people to justice, whoever they are, but to not jump to conclusions and to go out there and make these allegations and assertions about who is actually involved. That is something that I don't think is really clear as yet.
Well, no, absolutely. I mean, that is why there is an investigation. But of course, it is that's the way the police operate anywhere in the world. They say they've arrested suspects, and they try and put the information that they've got to justify the arrest. But you mentioned the reaction of the Haitian people to the call by the acting Prime Minister appealing for help from the US and the UN to secure the country. I mean, don't you and the people you talk to think that Haiti needs help to form a legitimate government, and those who are claiming to be the legitimate government barely have any forces to keep order in the country right now, so they need some form of external help?
Right. So, I think Haiti has been the receiver and on the receiving end of help for decades and decades and decades. And so at some point, the question about the kind of help that has always been given to this country, at some point, people must ask, why is it not better? What is the problem? And so the 2 people that I spoke to, both of whom work in international development, said to me that there is a consensus in the country that, and again, of course, we couldn't have an answer. We don't know what everyone feels, but just there was this general consensus in the country that there is no need for a military intervention, that there's the UN integrated office, there's a stabilizing force that's been in Haiti for many years, and that this idea that the UN will be the sort of arbiter or the decider, or that again, external forces being able to decide again for this country what's best has been the basis of the problems that have sort of been going on for so long. So while the people that I talk to agree that there is need for support, it has to also mean that we are willing to hear what Haitians are asking for and what kind of support that means. And if it's not military intervention, then what is it? So if it's an investigation support to kind of make sure that the people that committed this act are brought to justice, that's one thing. But at the same time, it's important to address the security issues. There's no doubt about that. And I do not mean to downplay it. But I feel that as a person having worked in that country after the earthquake and watching the extensive footprint of the international community with all of their help, and we are still here today. And so it means that there is some parts of this that we are not able to address in a way that can have an impact and that can advance the country. And I think we also need to challenge what this help is going to look like again in this country after all these years.
Well, absolutely. But of course, the international community is on the outside looking in, and they're simply responding to a request by the interim prime minister who appears to be in charge. I mean, the other crisis, of course, that you mentioned is political. I mean, we've got two men claiming to be prime minister, as you mentioned earlier, one claiming to be provisional president, and so it almost seems as if it's a necessary thing to have some form of intervention to stabilize the situation and at least help the country move to elections. But your sense is that it's a risky step asking the US to perform security duties for Haiti. I mean, of course, the US clearly doesn't appear interested in any case at all for another troop presence in another country.
Absolutely not. And you know what? So let's just back up a second and go back to 2010 after the earthquake. If you look back at that period of time, which is the period of time that I spent in Haiti, this is exactly what happened. There was this call for elections. There was this, we need elections, because the US often takes elections as a sign of stability, as though elections happen in a vacuum. And so elections happened, and there was elections against the backdrop of an earthquake, which meant that there was a lot of ambiguities in the election, and there was a lot of struggles in the aftermath to kind of figure out what was the best way to move forward. I'm only bringing that up to say that here we are again, and we're calling for elections amidst a pandemic, amidst security questions. And you're correct in your analysis that the US doesn't appear as yet to be willing to go in and send any troops. So what is Haiti to do? But let's not forget, Haiti is also a member of the Caribbean community. It's not as though Haiti is, a member of, it is close to the US and not a part of a group of small island nations, of course, that have, some that must come forward, I think, and make some acknowledgement about the situation and look at opportunities for how the Caribbean community are going to engage with Haiti on the issue of the elections. So I say all of that just to say that my impression from the conversations I had yesterday with two people who are, pretty connected and political in the country is that this is not where they want to go as yet. Certainly not.
Angela, I don't mean to interrupt you. We're going to take a break, but we'll come back and we'll keep chatting. Well, that's an interesting thought. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the evolving situation in Haiti. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, in the wake of President Moise's Assassination, Haiti is once again facing political uncertainty that further compounds the country's fragile security and humanitarian situation. It's a country at an inflection point. President Moise did not hold a single election, local or legislative, during his presidency, and there are less than a dozen elected officials in the country, according to the Miami Herald. The Constitution states that the head of Haiti's Supreme Court succeeds the president, but he died of COVID-19 last week. Acting Haitian Prime Minister Claude Joseph declared a state of siege and himself the new leader, even though he was to be replaced by a new prime minister appointed by Mr. Moise days before the assassination. Before his death, Mr. Moise agreed to elections in September, but it is far from clear if the country can hold the vote in the wake of his murder. So a country faced with political uncertainty, in addition to a host of other problems. And still with me in the, joining me from Washington is, of course, Angela Bruce-Raeburn, who is the Associate Director for Advocacy at the Global Health Incubator and the former Senior Policy Advisor for Humanitarian Response in Haiti for Oxfam. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And you were talking at the outset of the presence of gangs in Haiti. There's been a warning recently from one of the country's most powerful gang leaders, a chap called Jimmy Cherizier, saying his men would take to the streets to protest against the assassination. I'm wondering what sense you have of the significance of that potentially, because he's said to be very powerful and apparently holds court as a de facto president who controls a vast part of Haiti. He's armed to the teeth, and the police are said to be no match for these gangs.
This is a lot of this conversation, particularly around gangs. I don't really feel that I know enough about that situation, but I did ask someone in Haiti yesterday about that and about the, what does that mean? And there's a sense again that people are talking about how that we're going to take to the streets and there's going to be all this chaos. But so far, that has not been the case. And so one of my Haitian colleagues said to me that there's a feeling that things are going to sort of jump off based on some of these conversations around the gangs in the country, but it has not yet happened. And so I don't know that it will happen, but that it's possible. Haiti, yes, Haiti, the gang situation in Haiti is serious. It has been a real security issue over in this past year, especially. So yes, that it's possible. But as of right now, it has not been this sort of people taken to the streets in the wake of the death of the president. That has not happened yet based on the intelligence that I received.
Right. Well, what we're trying to do, obviously, is to tap your knowledge of Haiti. You spent time there, and you also have quite a lot of contacts there. And some reports coming out of the country have called the arrest of these Colombians and all the rest of them the theater of the absurd. They suggest that these people had nothing to do with the killing, but were in Haiti working with the national police to contain gangs. And when this went down, they went after them and accused them of being the hitmen. What are you hearing about that? Because you touched on this briefly at the outset, but we didn't quite get into it.
That's exactly what I'm hearing. That this seems completely absurd. That's exactly what I'm hearing. And which is why I said at the beginning, Haiti is a country of intrigue. Yeah, intrigue and interests of very political groups and very political forces, internally and externally. It's a fascinating island in that respect. And so there's this question about who are these Colombians? Where did these people just come from? And how it looks as though there's an attempt to sort of pin this on people in a way that is going to preclude us from getting at the truth. And that is something that I heard yesterday, and I think that is probably quite accurate. And so, again, the question about getting good intelligence and allowing and having the U.S. support the investigation is something that the reason why people are calling for it is because of this sense that what we're hearing about these Colombians and all these things seem a little bit absurd, to be honest.
So it is your sense then that the populace support the idea of the Americans coming in to help with the investigation. I mean, there are already Americans from the Justice Department, I believe, who are in Haiti trying to help with that investigation. But then on the other hand, there are also people who allege that that there is some form of, and I emphasize the word allege, it's an allegation, that there's some form of possible U.S. involvement in the assassination. Doesn't that render it a bit sort of difficult for the people coming from America to do a proper investigation?
I have heard these allegations. I do not know anything about it, that there's a connection. There was conversations that some of the people were Haitian American and that there's an American connection. I've heard this. I don't know anything about these allegations. And you're right, that does present a problem for the investigation. But I think that there is a general consensus that the U.S. could bring sort of the knowledge and the technical know-how about how to really conduct these kinds of investigations so that we don't end up with some farce of an investigation and no truth at the end. There is that belief that that is possible. And that is what I think many Haitian people would like to see.
And of course, as we said when we started the conversation, lots of questions yet to be answered. And amongst those being raised is the protection of the president. And why was that so lacking? Because from what I understand, there is a code that allows you to get into the president's bedroom. You have to have that code, and that code is only held by a number of people. So there are a lot of questions about whether or not this was an inside job, but I don't suppose you're hearing anything about that?
Not yet, no. No.
Right. So let me ask you this then. I mean, based on your knowledge of Haiti, based on the things that you've heard, based on the people you've spoken to, what do you expect to happen next? Do you expect the situation to disintegrate further in Haiti, or do you expect that any other country, I mean, the US says it doesn't want to send any troops, do you expect that any other country might be willing to step in to fill the security vacuum in Haiti? For example, the CARICOM countries that are neighbors of Haiti.
Right. The person I talked to yesterday, there's a sense that the political crisis is a very real crisis. That the constitutional issue around who is the rightful person to assume the leadership is real, and it could really have long-term impact on whether or not elections are going to even be allowed to happen. So it's not to dismiss these very real issues that are also having an impact on the more vulnerable people in the country, right? Because once these crises start escalating, the security situation deteriorates, the next thing that's going to happen is that international organizations and groups that are, helping in Haiti, they start packing up, they start, doing less work because of the fact that the security situation impacts them. And of course, who is hurt among all these groups? Of course, it's the most vulnerable populations in the country. That's already starting to happen. That the NGOs are starting to be a little bit weary of the security issue. The CARICOM, as a person who comes from the Caribbean region, I don't know that the CARICOM is even able.
I'm really sorry to interrupt you, Angela, but we're out of time. But I want to thank you very much indeed. Very, fascinating conversation there with you. Angela Bruce-Raeburn is the former Senior Policy Advisor for Humanitarian Response in Haiti for Oxfam. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow from me and the entire team here in Abuja and Washington. Bye-bye, and thank you for watching.